Hello, hello everyone. So Kimberly, I imagine that we're going to be taking questions through the chat room, and it will be a very interactive session. I'm going to ask you at many times to be putting some ideas into the chat room. So I'll ask Kimberly to be monitoring some things, and perhaps Mark as well, because it may be difficult for me to be keeping track of things as we go along. So if questions come along, post them into the chat room and we'll go back and find things. So I was asked to come up with what are my most commonly asked questions. I have been at Blackboard for 9 years. I was a training manager for a number of those years. I was a training consultant on the road, and I have worked with literally hundreds of clients. And when we began using a number, as a number of collaboration tools grew, clients became a little confused and began asking, what exactly is the difference between a discussion forum and a blog? And when would I use one instead of the other? And that has become one of the most common questions that I've seen over the last couple of years. So that is the question I'm going to attempt to answer right now. And what I would say, I would characterize a discussion forum is really an extension of your classroom. So if you think about a face-to-face classroom, you would hope that it would be highly interactive. You would have students interacting with each other in a kind of chain way, and we would call that a threaded discussion on Blackboard, but they would be multiple responses to one another. On Blackboard, that might be a staggered response time. So you may have the question needing to be answered on a certain day, and then responses to those posts happening on a different day. So the discussion forum is usually handled in that way. And people do a number of things with discussions, and please post in the chat room now just some of the ways in which you use the discussion forum, some like different ways that perhaps you're using it. But I have seen people use it for reactions to readings, for ideas that they have, for topics to papers, feedback that they want to give, opinions that they have about topics that are going on within the classroom. And they use it for any number of different types of classroom activities, from projects, initial thoughts, brainstorming, and even more creative things like debates and role play, and even peer review have been done. Yes, Mark is saying debates and critiques, and discussions, class questions, etc. And so as I have an example here for you of a discussion, and I think this is a particularly good one. It's fairly long. I'll let you kind of read it. This is from a business class, and in it the instructor has asked the students to describe a time when you've had a conflict with a colleague. And the students are asked to identify which of the 5 conflict management styles identified in the reading you used to resolve the conflict. And they're to select one of the styles and explain how the outcome of the conflict would have changed if you had used it. And that's what they have to do by Wednesday. And then by Friday, they have to respond to at least 2 of the colleagues' posts. But notice that the instructor is very specific about how they're to respond. They have to share an observation about the similarities or differences between the conflict management style identified by your colleague and your own style. Do you think your colleague could have used another style? And if your colleague had used a different style, explain how the conflict might have changed. And then notice the last activity. Return to the discussion to read responses to your initial post and then reflect on what you learned and any insights that you gained. So we have really a very complex activity going on here over this week, that they are not only posting their own, they're posting to other colleagues, and then they are coming back to look what everybody said to their posts. Now we'll come back to this in a little bit, but we have a lot of interaction happening on this particular post. And as you probably know, you can use any variety of types of questions for discussions, exploratory types, challenges, diagnostic, action. The more complex that you use, sometimes the better the question. And we'll look a little bit at Bloom's taxonomy in a moment to see, how can you raise the level of difficulty of questions. Sometimes you will begin with more knowledge-based questions at the beginning of the term, and then you'll move to kind of higher level types of questions as the semester goes on. So you might begin with just, a summary type of thing, and then you will move to something that will require them to do a little bit more synthesis or a little bit more evaluation as time goes on. This is from an article at Carnegie Mellon, Design and Teach a Course Discussions. Now blogs, on the other hand, as I have used them, have been more of an ongoing development of ideas. So we know that in the public space, blogs tend to be much more individual, but in a Blackboard course, they can be course-focused or they can be group-focused as well. But I have seen them used more in an ongoing basis. So it's not just a single post, but more formative. So the student may post, may get some comments from others, and then may post, continue to refine that posting with some additional work on that particular writing. It may be they revise that initial writing, or they may add some more writing as well. Some of the ways I've seen it used can be almost like a showcase. There's often a lot of media added to it. So just a few examples, it could be some case studies, it might be a final draft to a research paper or a project, could be some analysis or commentaries. Throw some ideas into the chat room about how you have used blogs. I think I saw one yes, I saw one earlier where Paige had said she uses blogs to submit assignments so students can see each other's works. And that's I think, exactly what we're talking about, where it becomes somewhat of a showcase. So instead of having it just be an assignment where the instructor sees it, it becomes really kind of a showpiece where everyone is able to see it. A good example of this would be, I'm an English teacher by trade, and I know that when I have asked students to write poems, and they only turn them in to me, they turn in really poorly written poems because there's no audience for them. They feel like they can just do a kind of sloppy job and turn them in. But as soon as I make them put them into the blog area, suddenly the quality of those poems goes way up because they have a public audience. And I say public meaning the course. And suddenly they have some peers that are going to be seeing these poems, and they put a lot more effort into them. And they also then have an opportunity to get some feedback through the comments and some suggestions that could get them to make some revisions. And Rick says, well, can't this all be accomplished in a threaded discussion too? It can be, but again, the point of the threaded discussion is often that you're going to have a number of comments going back and forth on a lot of interaction, whereas a comment, more likely you're just going to have like a single comment on a blog or so. And it's going to be, I think, a lot of times more directed in the way of suggestions and not so much in the way of you know, sharing ideas and opinions and things like that. So here's a couple of samples from some courses that I found. From an early childhood education course, one of the instructors asked the students to share one of their favorite toddler games, include instructions, pictures, and toddler reactions. And so they were going to actually be either putting in some short videos or some pictures, and the other students could post comments to ask for more information where they needed it. So this would be something that would be ongoing, and it could even be more than one game if they wanted. Another creative one was have students keep a blog posing as a famous individual in American history. And my thought was this could also be politics, science, art, any kind of area. As students research this person, they post topics or events in their lives. Other people share comments and ask questions to which they reply, thus requiring more research. They could add photos, movies, and sound clips. So again, they're doing a research project, but they're getting input from the other students with kind of what information do you want to know more about. So I see some comments going on there in the thank you for answering, Mark. I appreciate that. So in our On-Demand Learning Center, and that's at ondemand.blackboard.com, you'll find a great section in there called Getting Started with Interactive Tools, and this is in our Communicating and Collaborating area. And it talks about the differences between blogs, journals, wikis, and discussion boards. And it's a great article that you could share with your colleagues and look on yourself. I think you would find it a helpful tool. So now I want to move on to the second question that I get asked most often. Thank you, Kimberly. And that is, how do I get students to participate in discussion forums? And I have been asked this question for a very long time. Before I came to Blackboard 9 years ago, I was a Blackboard administrator at Guilford Tech Community College in North Carolina. And I had a professor there who came to me and he said, my students are not responding to the discussion board. And I said to him, well, I don't understand. Why do you think that is? And he said, I don't know either. He said, I have a great question in there. In fact, I have the same question every week. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. It's find an article to read and write a summary of it and respond to 2 students. And that was his question for every single week for 16 weeks. And he didn't, and there was no grade, and the students were just supposed to do that out of the goodness of their heart. And he didn't know why the students weren't doing that. Well, I can tell you he was doing everything wrong. Everything about that was everything you would not want to do to get students to respond to a discussion board. So what I have found that if you want students to respond to a discussion, you should think about these 5 principles. The first thing is connect whatever you want them to do to your content. So if they have something in Chapter 3, try to have a discussion that is focused on Chapter 3, something relevant to whatever it is that you are actually learning that particular week. The second thing is try to vary the type of questions. So rather than always writing a summary from a news article, vary the types of questions where you might begin with something that might be a summary, but then you might move to things that might be more evaluation or compare and contrast or argument or something like that. And I'll show you some examples in just a moment. Third, try to vary your format so that it's different every week. You don't, you might have debate one week. You might move it to a small group and not have it be a full class discussion one week. You might do paired role play one week. You might not always have them respond to two other students. It might just be post their own point of view one week, so that it kind of gives them some freshness every single week to whatever it is that you want them to do. Using rubrics is another really important aspect, and that is make it very clear what your expectations are, so that they know what is the length that you want, what is the expectation in terms of, are you looking at the writing style as well as references? Are you looking at that they are you evaluating their responses to each other as well as how they are their own posts? So make it very clear through your rubric what it is that you're going to be evaluating. And then finally, grade the post. And that is the #1 way to get the students participating in the discussion, is they have to feel like it is a contribution toward their final grade. I just have never seen where students have the time to participate in discussions out of the goodness of their heart, even though they might want to do it as a learning activity. Many times they just do not have the time to do it otherwise. So those are the 5 areas that I have found are most useful for students to get students participating in discussions. If you have any other things that have been successful for you, please post them into the chat room. I know that many of you have had great success, or if you've had anything that has not worked, please use your chat room for that as well. And then I have here a taxonomy chart of Bloom's revised taxonomy. So this is Benjamin Bloom, who in the 1950s created a kind of taxonomy of learning outcomes, of learning behaviors. And in 1990s, this was revised to reflect more 20th century learning. And this is kind of the progression that we might follow with our students. We might begin with kind of remembering what do I recall about this text, and then move up to a creation. I've created new knowledge from what I have learned. And this is kind of the progression that we might follow in our development of questions. So what I thought we might do is think back to the activity, the discussion activity that we just looked at, the one where the student was asked to first of all write about their experience with their colleague. So we'll go back to it in a moment. Let's go back. So they've had a conflict with their colleague, and they're going to explain, identify which conflict management style they use to resolve. That was their first step. And then their second step was they're going to go to their other students, and they're going to compare how they would have handled it. Would they have done the same, or would they have used a different one? And explain how it might have been, how the outcome might have changed. So my question for you, post into the chat room, which taxonomy level do you think that the initial question is asking the students to use? So of these, which do you think the student is being asked to use? Any ideas? Right, Rod, they're definitely being asked to remember. Maybe even a little bit higher than that, though, I think. Yes, you're being asked to analyze. That's right. So in the student who is asked to do the comparison in the when the students are asked to write their responses, they're asked to compare their response to what the initial student wrote. But I think in the first situation, the students are actually probably doing something like remembering or understanding. They're more in this kind of lower level. They're somewhere in here in this understanding or application level. If you look at some of the other Bloom's taxonomy charts, you'll see that application is often used, has some terms applied to it that have things that say define or describe or things like that. And then the compare contrast is often this analyzing, exactly. But then I think you're exactly right about the evaluating. At the end, the student is asked to do evaluation of what have you learned from this whole thing? You know, have you been changed by this experience? You know, would you do things differently based on what you have learned? So this particular question was really a fantastic question. It took the student from a very low level, moved them throughout the week to a much higher level of learning. And if the student does progress through that week, it would have been a very good learning activity for the student. So that's the type of thing that we might be looking to do with our students, is to take them through something where they begin, I'll go back again, where they begin at a simple level, where they're just going to recall an experience and apply their situation. You know, you had this, you're going to apply what kind of conflict style did you use, and explain how the outcome would have changed if you had used it, okay? And then, now you're going to compare to another student and explain how the outcome might have changed if your colleague would have used that one. And then finally, you're going to evaluate what have you learned by this whole thing, kind of a metacognitive type of thing. So really a very good learning activity for the students in this discussion. And you can see how this is a much more robust learning experience than read an article and write a summary of it and respond to two students, and where the students would be much more engaged in this kind of activity. So let me stop there and open up for questions. Mark, it's your turn to share a little bit about yourself and let them know about what you can also tell us about discussion.
Okay, thanks, Connie. So yeah, my name is Mark Radcliffe. I'm Director of Professional Development for the Blended Schools Network, and we are a company that serves K-12 schools. And I guess with that in mind, when I look at discussions and blogs, thinking in terms of some of the sort of same things that Connie said, but when recommending differences to K through 12 teachers, one of the things that I always point out when it comes to sort of blogs versus discussions is that in technical terms, the blog tool is a simpler tool to use than the discussion board tool. So when you're looking at sort of K through 5, you know, which we have programs running in that range, many of those students, they just don't have the dexterity or they're not developed enough to really fully interact with a threaded discussion. So very frequently when it comes to younger students, we tend to recommend using blogs over discussion boards just because of the simplicity of that. And discussion, yeah, and the other thing too is kind of in terms of a learning curve. If you got a very new teacher, sometimes blogs are a good starting point in Blackboard because they are very simple to set up. They have minimal options and minimal choices. And I don't know about everybody else, but I often find that with newer instructors, collaboration is usually the last thing they learn to do. It's the thing they're the least comfortable with. And oftentimes they're worried about, you know, what happens if a collaboration activity goes out of control or something like that. And to make collaboration accessible, we tend to introduce the simplest tools first. So we might start with journaling, which, you know, is really not collaboration, but it is a kind of open-ended, more free-form type of tool. And then we might progress them on the blogs, because in Blackboard, the blogging tool and the journaling tool are almost identical in terms of how they're used, so that the skill transfers very easily to blogs. And then they'll eventually get to a point where they'll say, you know, this posting and commenting isn't really quite getting the job done. And that's when they tend to transition into discussions as well. I think one of the other things, again, from the technical standpoint, is that the discussion board, my personal opinion is on the Blackboard mobile app, the discussion board is a little bit better than the journal and the blog. So if they're doing mobile posting, you know, they're out in the field or something like that, the discussion board tool is really good for that kind of thing. Then when we get into the high school level, it's more a case of analyzing the activity. Okay, you know, is this a simple reflection activity? Students might be reading a paragraph and producing a reflection on it, probably more suitable in a blog in that kind of situation. Or is it some kind of complex analysis with lots of differing opinions that would require threading? And that's where we look at the discussion board. So I guess it depends somewhat on complexity of activity. Then the other thing I guess I would say is in terms of getting students to respond to discussion and blog prompts, there's sort of three things that we tend to look at with that. And you don't necessarily have to do all three things in every activity. I think that's an overriding thought, is that when you look at, and here we have, thanks for putting the slide up, this tips for successful discussions. And when you talk about varying types of questions, sometimes it's also important to vary the usage. In other words, grade some, don't grade others, use rubrics on some, use rubrics on others. So varying what the activity itself looks like. But there are sort of three things that we really focus on. Number one is trying to encourage opinion. So making prompts be divisive in some way. If you can set up a prompt that will allow or cause people to have a disagreement, they're more likely to contribute to that activity. People love to disagree and people love to argue. And an important 21st century skill is debate and arguing your point and knowing how to provide a valid argument, and that's kind of one of those things that bridges all content areas. And it's a good way to experiment too, looking at a subject and saying, okay, how can I present this subject in a way that will get people putting their opinion in, disagreeing with each other, debating, anything along those lines is good. And that the prompt that Connie showed, essentially is in that realm. The sample discussion here. Do you think colleagues should have used another conflict management style in resolving this conflict? That's a divisive statement. People are going to be looking at other people's postings and saying, I agree or disagree with this point. This is how I would do it better. So that right there is a divisive statement, and will get people to hopefully disagree and debate. The other is allowing creation. Again, this is something that Connie hit on, is upper level of Bloom's, is trying to look at a prompt and coming up with a way that a student has the ability to create something original. So classic example, a couple of examples of that might be if you're doing something like biology and you're introducing students to the animal kingdom, have them create their own animal that doesn't exist in nature and place it into the appropriate areas of the kingdom. What are the attributes of the animal? Where would it live? Gives them some ability to create. With something like math, one of the key components, for math learning is being able to solve word-based math problems. So having students create their own word-based problems is not only a good way to have them create, but it also hits another piece of the puzzle when it comes to discussions and blogs and so on, which is trying to connect the students together. And, as one teacher, we try to present our instruction in a way that is accessible to multiple learning styles, but ultimately, much like a painter painting faces, we end up painting ourselves, and we end up favoring the instructional mode that we're most comfortable with. When you start to use discussion boards to have students sort of flip the instruction on its head and say, well, how would you instruct on this topic? You get a much wider range of instructional styles coming out, and students can actually begin to learn from each other. And that sort of hits the third point, is that you want to try and connect students to each other, and if possible, through some sort of real life experience. So again, this sample discussion board post here does exactly that, right? It describes a time when you had a conflict with a colleague, you're connecting it to real life. But the thing I want to say is that can run all the way down to the kindergarten level. It's just a case of making it simpler, single statements. This has 3 or 4 attributes to it. At the kindergarten level, you might have just one attribute. And it can be as simple as, what's your favorite color? Where does that color appear in some piece of clothing that you chose to wear on a certain day? Anything along those lines. All of these things can be rolled all the way down to the kindergarten level. So I guess that would be my overall statement. Hope that was useful.
Great, thanks, Mark. I think that was a great summarization of the progression of how to use the tools from the most basic level to much more sophisticated, multifaceted level in the higher ed space. Are there any other questions out there for Connie or Mark in the chat? Okay, we can just hang on the line for a few more moments. If you do come up with any other questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll wrap up in a few moments, and we'll have the follow-up email sent out next week with the recording, as well as any additional resources that were referred to in this session. we'll just hang on for a few more minutes in case you have any other additional questions.
So we have a question about a good source for discussion rubrics. I wonder, Mark, if you have an answer for that one?
Well, there is, the first resource that comes to mind for any kind of rubric would be Rubistar. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rubistar or not, but it's kind of a go-to. I'm going to paste the URL into the box there. Kind of the go-to rubric website, and there are thousands of rubrics in there, and I know that I've used them many times in the past. There are also some plugins for Blackboard, and one of them is escaping my memory right now. But there's one rubric plugin for Blackboard that can actually pull rubrics directly from Rubistar and apply them inside your Blackboard courses. And if you give me about 30 seconds here, I'll be able to remind myself what it's called. I just discovered it here. It's called Waypoint Outcomes. I've actually used Waypoint in a little while, but I have used it in the past, and it integrates with Rubistar. I'm just looking up the website right now, and allows you to search Rubistar and then pull the Rubistar rubrics directly into your Blackboard courses and grade from them. So that's kind of cool. And of course, like Iris just said, Blackboard has, of course, its own built-in rubric tool, which Connie talked about rubrics a little bit. But the thing I like about the Blackboard rubric tool is it's very quick and very simple. So you can build incredibly simple rubrics even that a kindergartner would understand the grading on. So that's pretty cool too. But that's Waypoint Outcomes. That's the one that integrates with Rubistar.
I have noticed also that there are a number of discussion rubrics available on the web, and if you simply Google even Blackboard discussion rubrics, a number of options come up, and I think they'll give you some samples of what you might do. I've never found one that exactly matched exactly what I wanted, but I have been able to get some ideas from them. And then you can then go into Blackboard yourself and create the rubric from the rubric tool. Okay, super. And then the other question about the third most frequently asked question about collaboration tools, I would definitely say that it came up around the question of the wiki. And I think that what we found was that instructors were really quite surprised when they learned that the wiki allowed students to actually collaborate at the same time. That's when we first started teaching the wiki tool. I remember the aha moment when a room full of instructors went, "You mean they can edit each other's work?" And then it's like, yes, that's what a wiki is. And so that is really, the question came up, well, how do you control that? How do you keep, manage wiki work in a controlled environment? And I think the answer to that really is to do small group wikis. I don't think in by experience that in Blackboard it works very well to have the entire class working on a single wiki without having it broken up into pages or something like that in a controlled way. But the wiki tool works very well as a small group activity. So that's what I would say would be my third question that I get the most often is how do you manage the wiki tool in Blackboard? All right. Any other questions? Thank you for those two questions. Great questions.
You have a little bit of conversation going on in the chat around a user-friendly math editor and an equation editor. So, and I know I did see that it is in the newest service pack. I can look into that and see if there is any additional information available for you and provide that in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah, just to respond to that too, we do get that question fairly frequently from math teachers is, you know, what's the easiest way for students to show working, to draw graphs, to do all those types of things that, you know, a keyboard doesn't necessarily really allow you to do very quickly and easily. And the new equation editor is significantly better in the whichever version of Blackboard it came in. It was, I guess, B12 or something like that. But you know, there are times where I wouldn't necessarily make it too complicated or try to force a tool to do something that it's not intended to. And we definitely have courses where we have students draw on a piece of paper, take a picture of it, and post it to an assignment in Blackboard. Like, we do that fairly frequently in our courses. And there are certainly tools, you know, like I know Google Apps has a pretty good drawing tool, which works great, and you can do Google App integration with Blackboard if you want to. But depending on the age of the student and depending on how much time, don't fall into that kind of quagmire of technology for technology's sake. There are certainly applications where, you know, literally drawing it on a piece of paper, taking a picture, submitting it is going to work great. And if you use Blackboard's new inline grading tool, which came a couple of service packs ago too, you can even do markup on those submissions, which is nice as well. So.
All right, and that's a great suggestion. Sometimes it's nice to go back to the basics and simplify. All right, if there aren't any other questions, I think we will wrap up the session today. I just want to thank you all for joining during this office hours session. I want to thank Mark and Connie for their sharing their best practices and their experiences with us. Again, I will have a follow-up email for you next week, and I hope to see you for our next webinar on Monday, March 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Have a great day, everyone.